monetary authority. So three sandboxes for Hong Kong. I realize that sandboxes are just one tool in the toolkit. We have done some extensive work over the past couple of years in really defining what the other tools are in the toolkit. And we've seen some really interesting things from abroad in terms of how some of these countries are responding to fintech, and some of those other tools, whether it be primers, whether it be frankly just speeches, prepared remarks, but also restricted authorizations, some interesting stuff related to banking on-ramps. If you look recently at Australia and Israel, they are in an effort right now to allow a company to progressively meet regulatory requirements over a 2 to 3 year period and then fully become an authorized bank, which is really interesting and something that I think we should focus on here, especially for a lot of the non-banks that are looking to become banks. There's a whole host of other tools in the toolkit. Happy to send you all of our work on that, but nonetheless, a lot is going on out there. And I will say, though, that just to end it, with all these tools, there's really a challenge for regulators both in the U.S. and around the world of what is it exactly that we want to solve for, right? And then what does success look like? And frankly, we're still on the fence with a lot of these initiatives and alternative licensing frameworks from around the world in terms of what does success look like. And frankly, we can point to two in particular that we're really interested in. In Thailand, for instance, they set out a national QR code payments policy, and that was driven by allowing a number of banks to come into the sandbox and test this framework out, and then understand the positives and negatives about it, and then develop a national policy from that testing framework. In Malaysia, what we've seen is an eKYC regime that they've adopted there on a national level with all their financial institutions. And what's interesting about that is that they included a number of their banks into their sandbox and tested this regime to see how it would work, realized the positives and negatives of it, and then created a national policy out of it. And so those to us are kind of like the successful outcomes from a lot of these the tools. So I'll stop there.
Jackson, I think everybody's wondering when you actually have time to sleep. That's an impressive survey. Okay, Alex, I'm going to come back to you. So again, multi-part question, but first, how much do you think regulation matters when you think about the potential success or trajectory of a fintech company? And then secondly, do you look at that? I mean, to the extent that there are firms that you're thinking about investing in, do you look at global regulatory frameworks? Does that impact whether you are ultimately going to decide to invest or not? So get your take there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, it's critical, and I just harken back to my earlier point. I mean, the regulatory and compliance sort of posture of an early stage company is important for at least two main reasons. One is relates to what I consider to be on the liability side of the balance sheet, so to speak, where what are the reputational and regulatory risks associated with the compliance sophistication of the underlying team. This is kind of a lot of what people think about when they think about regulatory and compliance, and so there is that standard concern that we'll have as investors. The other side where we focus a lot is actually on the asset side of the balance sheet, again, using that metaphor, where having a strong regulatory level of sophistication is more than just kind of insurance against regulatory or reputational risk, but it does allow companies to actually see around corners and be able to identify new opportunities and how external factors are going to be influencing their market size, how they can structure products in ways that are more or less regulatory intensive. And so I think for us, we sort of consider all of those things when we invest in companies, and indeed, that we also try to help them with those things. In terms of, from my perspective, again, as a bank regulatory lawyer, I've been fascinated with the introduction of fintech. I don't think I can recall in at least my professional career where we have seen such a grand experiment taking place on a global level in financial services so rapidly, with the new technologies new business models and different kinds of regulatory regimes emerging kind of in real time across the world. And so, in lots of different areas, we will look at the global framework to try to get a sense for like what does the future look like, because there has been a lot of experimentation and a lot of diversity in terms of how jurisdictions have handled these issues. It's not uniform. And so, there's a bunch of examples of this, right? And Jackson talked about some of them, but obviously in the digital asset, cryptocurrency space, new kinds of securities offerings, or whether they are securities offerings, or how should these new digital objects even be treated? Privacy and data security issues, from GDPR to Singapore taking the lead there, EU and Singapore taking the lead there in a lot of ways. Open banking, and what are the roles of traditional financial institutions going to be going forward, and what does that mean for fintech companies that are innovating in those markets? How can personal data be used by financial services companies? Is there a concept of fair lending in the jurisdiction? How are different jurisdictions treating that issue? And then on the KYC and AML side, it's a problem every country faces, but the solutions that are being looked at are different. And so, for us, obviously, the companies we invest in do operate in a certain market. So that market is, and usually with our companies, that is the U.S. But it is, I think, imperative to look at how other countries are handling these issues, because I do think there will be a best practices sharing across the world through events like these, and just as different jurisdictions see what's working well and what's not for other countries facing similar problems.
All right, so take that question over to Kristen now. And look, as we've talked about, I think there are a few areas of fintech that are as global as blockchain. So what are some of your insights? What have you seen that's worked perhaps well internationally? Are there any models that you've seen develop that are worth us looking at?
Yes and no. We, when I talk with our members, a lot of them are excited with, some of the sandboxes that are out there and some of those approaches. I think when we're looking as to what we should do in the U.S., we don't have a perfect model that we've seen internationally, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. Just first, here in the U.S., the way that our agencies are separate, and we have the SEC, we have the CFTC, we have FinCEN, we have what used to be the CFPB, whatever we're calling it these days. It's so many different places. So in addition to figuring out how do we treat these, we also have to figure out where do we put them and where do they belong. And going back to one of our primary priorities in figuring out what is a security and what is not a security, we need a home for that. And there's debate as to where that should be. But what we haven't seen is a good model abroad for how do you regulate these tokens that aren't securities, that aren't even kind of pure commodities, but have this sort of functional use that's doing something new and different than we've seen out there. And I think we're thinking about how to do that here within our framework, but always looking abroad for ideas and examples. But there isn't one perfect place that has the pieces that we need at this time.
All right, so I want people to start thinking about questions that you may have, so I'll open it up in a moment. But I'll ask one more question of the entire panel while people are thinking.